Welcome into the Wire on Fantasy Football Podcast. We are still in the middle of our divisional breakdown. Today we'll be talking about the AFC North. As you can see, Bryan cannot be with us due to a time constraint, so the Fantasy Force here won't be here. It's just me, John, your monotone master, going through the four teams of the Steelers, Ravens, Browns, and Bengals on today's episode. So the deep dive into the division, we're looking at each position with a little more in depth, examining the trends and tendencies of each position on the team. Longer episodes filled with information in depth. We're going to give you a verdict on if you should actually want this player on your team or not. And if you feel like you want to disagree with me, leave it in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and debate you on what you think about the individual player we're going to talk about. So starting off, we're talking about the Pittsburg Steelers, the top of the division, 12-4, had that memorable wildcard loss to divisional opponents, the Cleveland Browns. Their quarterback, Ben Roethlisberger. Running backs this year will be Najee Harris. Right now, Benny Snell Jr. could be cut though before camp. Their wide receiver room is Juju Smith-Schuster, Chase Claypool, and Deontay Johnson. At tight ends, they have Eric Ebron and Pat Freiermuth. Probably not pronouncing that correctly. They had the 24th ranked offense last year and the 3rd ranked defense. They had a 64-36 pass run split, so they're very pass heavy. They have the hardest schedule going into 2021 with a new offensive coordinator in Matt Canada. So starting with their quarterback, Ben Roethlisberger. Last year he was the quarterback 14, averaging 18.4 points per game, throwing for over 3,800 yards, 33 touchdowns, 10 interceptions on 608 attempts. That's honestly about 50 to 60 more attempts than the average quarterback out there. So that's like an extra 2 games of throwing the ball built into his season. He had 5 games over 20 points and 1 game under 10 points. He was very average, as his numbers suggest. Averaged about throwing 40 attempts, throwing the ball for 250 yards, which gives you a base of 10 points per game in just throwing yards each week. He's now another year removed from his injury to his throwing shoulder, which he suffered in 2019, which took away the majority of that season when you experienced the Duck Hodges season, which was terrible. But as the 2020 season progressed last year, you saw that the Steelers, they lost that deep ball game and the running game, which then preceded them to basically operate on a short to medium throw only, which is why Ben is throwing 40 times per game. So my verdict for Big Ben is he's past his prime. He's not going to get any better with age or being removed from the injury, in my opinion. Don't draft him this year. He's going to be a streamer going to next year. You're going to want to play him in good matchups, but when they face a difficult opponent, there's going to be a good chance where he's probably going to disappoint you, and you're going to be left there sitting there like, my quarterback threw for 50 times, but he only ended up with 15 points. He's going to be a frustrating quarterback to own, so just leave him in the stream and pick him up on the weeks you need to if you don't have a reliable quarterback on your own team. Going to the running back room, we have running back rookie sensation Najee Harris out of Alabama, being backed up by one of Benny Snell, Anthony McFarland, or Kalen Ballage. Focusing on just Najee Harris, he's the first running back taken in the 2021 draft. He ran for over 1,400 yards, 26 touchdowns, added on another 40 receptions for 425 yards in his final season at Alabama. He's a workhorse 3-down back. He could be leaned on in the Steelers offense if Big Ben shows he really can't get it done this year and the team has to go through Najee Harris instead of going through Big Ben in the passing offense. Typically, Steelers head coach Mike Tomlin wants a running back who can stay on the field for every single down. This sort of advantage allows the offense to be unpredictable, at least to an extent on the defense. Because if you're throwing in a 3rd-down back who's specifically good at catching the ball, the defense knows you're most likely going to pass it. But for some reason, you decide to run on 3rd down. If you have the same back in the backfield each down, it's going to be harder to predict when you're going to run or throw the football. And then the backups are really just going to be handcuffs if Najee Harris gets hurt. But I think in the scenario when Najee Harris does get hurt, the team is going to shift back to a pass-happy offense instead of trying to rely on its secondary or 3rd down running back who's not going to be able to get the job done. As we saw last year when James Conner went down, their backfield was not the same trying to work through Benny Snell or Anthony McFarland. Looking at their wide receiver room, you're looking at Juju Smith-Schuster, Chase Claypool, and Deontay Johnson. So starting from the top, we had Juju Smith-Schuster, wide receiver 18, which he felt like he disappointed you as a fantasy owner, but he still finished within the same range that you drafted him as. He had a 19% target share and averaged 11.6 points per game, had 97 receptions, which equated to 131 yards, 9 touchdowns. He had 2 games over 20 points, but what his managers remember is the 6th game under 10 points, and if you were playing in a standard league, he had 1 game where he finished with negative 0.5 points, which is just not what you want from a starting wide receiver. There has been news that he wants to be an outside receiver in the offense, which is also more bad news because Juju has tended to perform better as a slot receiver over his years and is practically useless as an outside receiver. Their new outside receiver, Chase Claypool, finished the year right behind them as the wide receiver 19. Rookie sensation had a 16% market share, and the offense averaged 11.5 points per game. Ended the year with 62 receptions for 873 yards and 9 touchdowns. So that 30 reception difference between him and Juju is basically just saying Juju's more of a possession wide receiver in the slot. Chase Claypool is more of a long ball, deep threat down the field. He had that 1 game where he had 4 touchdowns, which really made him break out, but that is his only game over 20 points. He suffered from having 8 games under 10 points and being a deep threat receiver. Once the offense shifted to a short, medium throw style, basically Big Ben didn't have the time to throw the ball downfield and let the play develop, which just led to a drop-off in the production that we saw from Chase Claypool early in the year. Now their third option on the team has now become Big Ben's favorite target. Deontay Johnson finished the year as the wide receiver 23, but he saw 23% of the target share, averaging 11.9 points per game. The difference is that he just missed the game. That's why his average is a little bit higher. So he had 88 receptions on 144 targets for 923 yards and 7 touchdowns. He had 2 games over 20 points, but 6 games under 10 points. So my verdict for the wide receivers is you're drafting them if you believe in Big Ben. Where Deontay Johnson is in drafts, he's going in that 5th round right now. That's a little too high for me just because I don't believe in Big Ben. The others, Juju Smith-Schuster and Chase Claypool, are there in the 7th. That's still a little too high for me. There are some options in that range which I would prefer over them. I just don't think they're going to have a giant pass-happy offense with a new OC. They just drafted Najee Harris, and Big Ben has shown that he can't throw the ball deep anymore, so I think they're going to lean more towards the run game. And they probably won't have as a productive season as they just did, given the fact they had the easiest schedule last year, and now they have the hardest schedule going into 2021. In the tight end room, you have Eric Ebron, who finished as the tight end 14 last year, saw 14% of the target share, averaged only 5.7 points per game. He had 56 receptions for 558 yards and 5 touchdowns. He had 5 games over 10 points, but 7 games under 8. So for Eric Ebron, you're drafting him if you believe in the Steelers, but I still view him as a high-end streamer from a week-to-week standpoint. If you're really desperate, he could be your tight end for the league, but I only want a tight end that's scoring more than 8 points per game. Down at 5.7, he's a little too inconsistent for me to be happy with him as my year-long tight end. The other tight end I mentioned, Pat Freiermuth, was a rookie sensation at tight end, but being in the super crowded offense, you most likely won't see much from him this year. Maybe once the team moves on from Eric Ebron in year 2, year 3, then you could see himself be a more reliable fantasy option. But that's still if they have Big Ben on the roster. So you're going to have to wait and see on Pat. Eric Ebron is just going to be a streamer for now. Going to the next team in the league, the Baltimore Ravens at 11-5 suffered a divisional loss to the Bills. At quarterback, they have Lamar Jackson. Their running back room is J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. For wide receivers, you got Sammy Watkins, Marquise Hollywood-Brown, and first-round pick Rashad Bateman. Tight end, as we all know him, Mark Andrews. On the year, the Ravens have the 19th ranked offense and 7th ranked defense in 2020. There's a 56-44 run-pass split. They're the most run-heavy team in the NFL. They have the second hardest schedule going into the 2021 season on top of that. So their quarterback is Lamar Jackson. We all know him as the MVP from 2 seasons ago. Finished this past year as the quarterback 10. averaging 22.7 points per game. He had a disappointing first half of the season, but he exploded to be the quarterback to the last half of the season, either ruining your chances at becoming a playoff-bound team, or if you somehow managed to acquire Lamar Jackson, he easily won you the league if you didn't draft him at the beginning of the season. He finished with about 2,800 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. But what makes Lamar Jackson super valuable is his rushing ability. Last year, he had over 1,000 rushing yards and 7 touchdowns. Those two stats alone would make him the running back 23 with those numbers. He runs about 10 times per game. So because of that, he has the lowest throwing amount in any NFL quarterback. He averages 25 attempts for only 180 yards per game. That's a 7.2 floor. But if you include his rushing floor, which is 6.7, you're looking at a quarterback that is a 13 to 14 point floor. So if he scores a rushing touchdown or he gets 1 or 2 passing touchdowns, you're looking at a 20 to 22 point a week. And that's how he averaged 22.7 points per game last year. So he has new weapons in Sammy Watkins and Rashad Bateman. He's not falling to earth in drafts. He's not going in the second round like he was last year. He's now down in the 5th round. So he's around your Kyler Murray, your Dak Prescott, your Aaron Rodgers. He's in that range where he's more reasonable taking him in drafts instead of reaching on him in the second round like people were last year. So my verdict is, if you're in the 5th round, you could potentially take Lamar Jackson. So I think the perfect scenario for him is if you're late in the draft order and you decided to go wide receiver or pass catcher heavy. You basically did the first 4 rounds. You went Travis Kelce or an elite wide receiver. You took a running back in round 2, but then you went wide receiver, running back, or wide receiver. So in the 5th round, there's not great running back options. So if you take Lamar Jackson, you're basically getting a mid-tier quarterback and a mid-tier running back built into the same position. So if you start the year off, for example, Travis Kelce, Cam Akers, then you go Amari Cooper, Julio Jones sort of scenario, Lamar Jackson might be that perfect 5th round pick for you. In the running back room, we've got J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards. So J.K. Dobbins, rookie year, came on strong towards the end of the year, but had a few games where he just fell into the end zone twice or didn't do anything for you at all. He finished the year as the running back 17, averaging 10 points per game, 805 yards and 9 touchdowns. He had 18 receptions for 120 yards, but because of the offense he plays in, he's constantly vultured by Lamar Jackson at the goal line, which is the downside to being on a team with an elite rushing quarterback. Another massive handcuff that he has is Gus Edwards, who's going to be more than a handcuff back because he just signed a 2-year extension to stay with the Ravens, had 723 yards and 6 rushing touchdowns, adding on 9 receptions for 120 yards. So he's an uber efficient running back once he gets the ball, but he doesn't get the ball enough times to be efficient as a long-time starter. He averages about 7.5 points per game, and he's going to be more than just a handcuff, as I've mentioned a few times. So my verdict is, I don't want to draft J.K. Dobbins where he is in the 3rd round because of Lamar Jackson going to be siphoning touchdowns away, and Gus Edwards being more than just a handcuff back who's going to have a role on the offense next to J.K. Dobbins. In the wide receiver room, you have Marquise Brown, Sammy Watkins, and new rookie Rashad Bateman. So Marquise Hollywood Brown was the number 1 wide receiver for this team last year. Finished the year as the wide receiver 34. With a 26% target share, he only averaged 9.6 points per game. Finished with 58 receptions for 770 yards and 8 touchdowns. He was very touchdown dependent. If he didn't score a touchdown, you left the week disappointed. He had 7 games under 10 points, and in one of those games was a goose, which means he didn't get a single catch or a single yard. He's a victim of his offensive scheme and not being a true number 1 wide receiver. He has the talent to break free and score, but he does struggle when he's in a big matchup with an elite defense or a strong corner. New addition to the team, Sammy Watkins, was coming over from the Chiefs. Finished last year as the wide receiver 92, averaging 7 points per game. 37 receptions for 421 yards and 2 touchdowns only. It was the 2nd year in a row where you saw a good week 1 from Sammy Watkins and then nothing for the rest of the year. He has been the problem where he has all the talent in the world when he came out of the draft years ago. He's just never been able to put together a full season of staying healthy or being consistent. The third option that they just added in this year's draft was Rashad Bateman. He was a first-round pick by the Baltimore Ravens. He was the 6th pass catcher off the board. His MO in college was he was a deep threat contested catch style player. My verdict is I really don't want any of them on my team if I'm in a position where I have to take one. It might be Rashad Bateman to see what happens, but the problem is the passing offense for the Ravens, the pie is so small that even if you have someone who has 25 or 26% of the market share like Marquise Hollywood-Brown, he's a wide receiver 3 or wide receiver 2 at best. There's 32 teams in the NFL. He's a wide receiver 34, which means he's not even, if every team had one number 1 receiver, he's still behind a team that has more than one of those. So that's what you have to think about. Marquise Hollywood-Brown has the speed to burn someone, but just doesn't get enough work to be productive for your fantasy team. The only pass catcher that's consistent and that you should draft on the Ravens team is their tight end, Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews finished last year as a tight end 4, had 23% of the target share, saw the most looks on his team, even though Hollywood had 26%. Mark Andrews still got more of the important looks and more yards. He averaged 10.1 points per game, had 58 receptions for 700 yards and 7 touchdowns, and had a few touchdowns where either it hit his hand in the end zone or he should have been able to reel it in or a penalty got in the way. So he could have finished a little bit better than he did. He had 7 games over 10 points and 6 games under 10 points. He's Lamar's favorite target and safety blanket. So when it comes to the tight end landscape, you want to draft Mark Andrews because for what he does, he's reliable at that tight end position. And he's the number 1 target in the offense when it comes to who's going to get the ball in the red zone in clutch situations. So if you're going to draft a Baltimore Ravens pass catcher, it's Mark Andrews or nothing. Now the team that finished 3rd in the division but made it the furthest in playoffs, the Cleveland Browns. Also going 11-5, they suffered a really tight loss to the Chiefs, which I honestly think the Browns did get screwed over by the refs in that game. A lot of the calls did go the Chiefs' way. And if those calls didn't, then the game would have been super close. But looking at the team, you got quarterback Baker Mayfield, running backs Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Your wide receiver room is Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry, and Rashad Higgins. Your tight end is Austin Hooper. They had the 16th ranked offense and 17th ranked defense in 2020. So they're super in the middle of the pack. They had a 48-52 run-pass split, so they're very even in that as well. And because of their division, they have the 9th hardest schedule going into 2021. But there are very high expectations for the Browns to have a good season because they're going to be in year 2 of the Steve Sarkisian system. And they had such a great year last year that they're expecting that to continue going into 2021. So the quarterback Baker Mayfield finished last year as the quarterback 17, averaging 16 points per game, throwing for 3,600 yards, 26 touchdowns to 8 interceptions, also adding in a sneaky 165 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Baker averages about 30 attempts per game for 220 yards, which gives you a base of 8.8 points per game. He had 4 games over 20 points, but 5 games under 10 points where he just lost you the week. But the good thing is it's the 2nd year in the same system. He has OBJ coming back healthy this year and Nick Chubb coming back healthy as well. But my verdict for Baker Mayfield is he's a late round quarterback if you don't believe in the quarterback you drafted. As you mentioned in the last episode, if you took Jalen Hurts, Carson Wentz is a good backup quarterback to take if you want to go the 2nd quarterback on your team route. Baker Mayfield is in that same category where he could have a good year, but because of the system that Baker plays in, it's so run heavy that he's not going to be throwing the ball a lot. His big games will come from situations where they're throwing a little bit more in the red zone and they do a little bit more receiving work than just running the ball in with Nick Chubb or Kareem Hunt. So for me, he's really just a streamer, but he could be an insurance policy if the first quarterback you take doesn't pan out. So speaking of the running backs, you've got Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, who interestingly enough finished as the running back 9 and running back 10 right next to each other. So Nick Chubb finished as the running back 9 while missing 4 games of the season, averages about 16.6 points per game, 1,000 yards, 12 touchdowns, 16 receptions for 150 yards. So he's similar to Derrick Henry in the sense where he's not used as a pass catcher. He's really just a run it down your throat kind of guy. Averages 5.6 yards per carry. and leads the backfield in an offense that made Dalvin Cook a monster. The only problem is you have someone named Kareem Hunt in that backfield taking all the receiving work. So Nick Chubb, as Bryan mentioned in the last episode, feels a lot like Jonathan Taylor, where he's a very talented player, but because of those around him in the running back backfield, he's not going to get that high-end fantasy production that you wish someone of his talent could get. Because Kareem Hunt, the running back 10 last year, averaged 12.5 points per game, 840 yards on the ground with 6 touchdowns, but then you throw in 38 receptions for 304 yards and another 5 touchdowns. He is the pass-catching third down back that the team also uses in the red zone if they're in a pass-heavy move. So the amount of times last year where Nick Chubb was in the game, would get taken out and Kareem Hunt would be put in and would end up scoring the touchdown, just frustrated Nick Chubb owners to the extreme. So my verdict is, if in the first round you're going to draft Nick Chubb knowing that for his consistency, but knowing that his ceiling is going to be capped as a mid-level RB1, he could end up finishing in that RB5 to RB10 range, given how productive he is, but he'll never crack that top 5 because Kareem Hunt is right there behind him. And you're going to be drafting Kareem Hunt knowing his role and knowing that he's an RB2 who might have an occasional RB1 game if he scores a few touchdowns, has a lot of passing work. But he's really sharing that backfield with Nick Chubb, even though he has the talent to be a 3-down back, because Cleveland likes having both of those guys in their backfield. They're going to have very split workloads and be used in different situations. So it's hard to really look at Kareem Hunt knowing what he could be, but the reality is he's an RB2 that could have a down game because Nick Chubb got all the work, or he could get a lot of passing work and give you numbers to support an RB2 role on your roster. For wide receivers, we got Odell Beckham, Jarvis Landry, and Rashad Higgins. So Odell Beckham has had a huge fall from grace. We're 4 years removed from the last time Odell Beckham was an elite fantasy option. It's hard to believe because you still see the talent and bursts, but he can no longer sustain that for an entire season until he proves us otherwise. Last year, he finished as a wide receiver 85. While he was still healthy, he had a 25% target share, but only averaged 10.8 points per game. His year ended with 23 receptions for 319 yards and 3 touchdowns, adding on that one game versus the Cowboys where he had a large amount of rushing yards and a touchdown. In that one game, he had 36 points. In the rest of the games that he played, he had 4 games under 10 points. Jarvis Landry, their wide receiver 2, finished as the wide receiver 36, had a 20% target share on the year, averaged 10.1 points per game, had 840 yards, 3 touchdowns for 72 receptions, 1 game over 20 points all year, 9 games under 10 points. You would think that once Odell was lost for the season, that Jarvis Landry might step into a bigger role, get more improved stats, but he only jumped up from the wide receiver 36 to the wide receiver 32 on the year. The third option in the system is Rashad Higgins, who has shined when he's got the ball. He's just never been able to get enough of a target share or workload to be productive consistently for a fantasy team. Finished the year as a wide receiver 62, averaging 7.9 points per game. He had 37 receptions for 600 yards and 4 touchdowns. His best game, he went 6 for 95 and 1 touchdown, which led to 18.5 points per fantasy points. But then he had 9 games under 10 points, and one of them was just a complete goose. So for the wide receiver room, my verdict is OBJ is a wide receiver 2. He has flashes of wide receiver 1 potential. You just have to realize they're in a run-first offensive system, which leans on Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Jarvis Landry is a low-end wide receiver 2. You can throw him in your flex and hope for the best, but he might only give you wide receiver 3 numbers. And Higgins is a wide receiver 3 on a good day. He might catch a touchdown and jump up to a wide receiver 2 level, but being the third wide receiver on a run-heavy offense, he's not going to be consistent enough for you to want to start him week in and week out. Their last position on the team, looking at the tight ends, you have Austin Hooper, who finished as the tight end 21, 14% target market share, averaging 7 points per game, which led to a 46 reception season for 435 yards and 4 touchdowns. He had 4 games over 10 points and 7 games under 8 points. So for me, Austin Hooper had his heyday when he was the main option as a tight end for Matt Ryan and the Falcons. But now that he's with a different system that doesn't focus on the passing game, he's a streamer at best. Now, he may end up being drafted as people just take their shot in the dark on tight ends. But for me, is you don't want to draft a tight end who has the hardest schedule, doesn't see a lot of volume, in a team that runs through running backs. So my verdict is don't draft him. He's going to be a streamer after week 1 or 2 when he gets cut from the team that does end up drafting him. Rounding out the AFC North is the Cincinnati Bengals, coming in at 4-12, missing playoffs. They're looking at quarterback Joe Burrow coming into his second year, running back Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine. Your wide receiver room is Tyler Boyd, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and their tight end is Drew Sample. They had the 29th ranked offense and the 26th ranked defense in 2020. They had a 40-60 run-pass split. They were very pass-heavy because they lost Joe Mixon and they have a very bad offensive line, which does not equate to a good running team. And they have the 6th hardest schedule coming into 2021, which is not a good sign for a team that's hoping to make that jump. So quarterback Joe Burrow, his rookie season was cut short by a horrific knee injury where he literally tore everything in his knee. He was the quarterback 16 until he was injured, averaging 17.9 points per game, which is what you'd expect from a rookie quarterback. Great college career, coming in with high expectations. Quarterback 16 is about where you'd expect him to be. In his 10 games, he had 2,600 yards passing, 13 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, threw in a sneaky 140 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. In his 10 games, he had 3 games over 20 points, 1 bust game under 10 points, and out of those 3 games over 20, one of them was 35. If you remember that game versus the Browns where they each ended up it was like a 35 to 32 point game. On a similar pace to Big Ben, Joe Burrow is averaging 40 attempts per game for 270 yards, which equates to a 10.8 point per game average. Now, the fear for Joe Burrow is with that giant knee injury, he's going to be less mobile in the pocket, which means he might not get that sneaky rushing upside that he had last year. But because of the division that they're playing and the state of the offensive line right now, it hasn't really been improved enough. Joe Burrow will most likely be throwing from the pocket a ton this season. So the hope is he can stay healthy and not take any big major hits that might end his season again. So my verdict is Joe Burrow is going too high in drafts. I know the numbers might look that he's going to be throwing a lot. He might be scoring a ton of touchdowns, but I'd rather wait and see from Joe Burrow than drafting with full confidence where he is in drafts. I'd much rather take a Matt Stafford or Ryan Tannehill right now than putting my faith in Joe Burrow because he doesn't have the best starting set of games to begin the season. So that means if you take Joe Burrow, you're going to be stuck dealing with him in the first 3 or 4 games where he doesn't have good matchups, coming off just a terrible knee injury, not knowing how he's going to play in that. Running back room, we got Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine. So Joe Mixon last year was lost to injury in week 6, finished as the running back 49 in the season. But in those 5 games he did play, he averaged 14.9 points per game, ended with 430 yards and 3 touchdowns. He had 21 receptions for 138 yards and 1 touchdown, so he was used heavily in the passing game. So that's about an average of 4 receptions per game, which means he gets more targets than that as well. So Joe Mixon has been a very tantalizing running back for fantasy managers. He had out of his 4-year career, so this is his year 2, year 3, he had 2 seasons over 1,000 yards. 2018, he was the running back 9 on the year. This was Andy Dalton's last quote-unquote good year as a starter when he finished as the quarterback 25. But in that year, Joe Mixon had a consistent base and you could start him week in and week out and not be disappointed. In 2019, he had a tale of 2 seasons. He finished the year as running back 13 on the season, but he was the running back 32 through the first 8 weeks. If you took Joe Mixon 2 years ago, he submarined your team with his first half of the season, then bounced back with an incredible second half. But at that point, if Joe Mixon was still on your team through the first 8 weeks, he most likely caused you to miss playoffs that year. Right now, backing him up is Samaje Perine, who finished last year as running back 67, averaging 3.8 points per game, 300 yards, 3 touchdowns, and just a handful of receptions. So right now, the news out of camp, offensive coordinator talking about Joe Mixon says he should be on the field for every single down. So if you believe in the Bengals this year, Joe Burrow year 2, if you believe they have a better offense, if you believe in the talent of Joe Mixon, Joe Mixon should have a good year, and where he's going in drafts is in the late in the second round or mid-second round. I think if you take an elite running back in round 1 and you just want to really have that giant monster running game, you could take Joe Mixon in round 2, knowing that he can either help your team or there is the reality where he could get hurt or the team could fall apart and he might disappoint you. I'm really hoping he has a 2018 year where he doesn't have a big boom games, but he's consistent week in and week out with his workload where he can be reliable and help you win each week versus just submarining your team like he did in 2019. In their wide receiver room, you got Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, and rookie sensation Jamar Chase. So last year, Tyler Boyd finished as the wide receiver 35, averaging 20% of the target share, which came to 10.2 points per game, had 79 receptions, 841 yards, and 4 touchdowns, plus a sneaky 50 rushing yards on the year. He's someone that I've never really wanted to draft. He's always been in that wide receiver 3, going to be wide receiver 2 tier, and it's just not someone like that inspires confidence for me. He's never going to have a big boom season. He's kind of settled himself as this possession receiver that's a solid wide receiver 2 for a team. Then you have T. Higgins, who in his rookie year finished the wide receiver 30, 19% target share, averaged 10.1 points per game, had 67 receptions for 908 yards and 6 touchdowns in his rookie season, which isn't bad for a rookie season, especially on a team that lost its starting quarterback and was playing in a league or a division that had 3 top-end defenses. So what he did his rookie year was pretty good. But the big attention grabber is Jamar Chase, rookie out of LSU. He was the first receiver drafted in 2021. He was Joe Burrow's go-to guy when they played together in college, so there's a known trust between the two. He sat out his 2020 season due to COVID. So in 2019, he was a higher NFL prospect than Justin Jefferson, who finished as the wide receiver 6 last year. And Jamar Chase could be on pace to absorb AJ Green's 104 vacant targets, which is only 19% of the target share in that offense. So if you believe that Joe Burrow will be choosing Jamar Chase as his number 1 go-to guy, 104 targets to Jamar Chase from Joe Burrow could lead to wide receiver 2, maybe even wide receiver 1 numbers, which is why Jamar Chase is going in round 6 right now. So my verdict is you're drafting Jamar Chase for wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 1 upside. And then I see Boyd as a wide receiver 2, just he's going to be stuck in that range. And then the T. Higgins truthers might see T. Higgins as a better option than Jamar Chase this year. And you're taking him thinking that Joe Burrow will trust T. Higgins a little bit more because he's shown that he can get it done at the NFL level. But I just lean towards Jamar Chase because he was his guy in college. Joe Burrow definitely had influence on the Bengals taking Jamar Chase instead of an offensive lineman, which they should have taken. So I just believe Jamar Chase might have the advantage over T. Higgins this year. It's just going to be a wait and see to see what happens in preseason. Rounding out this episode, we have the tight end Drew Sample, who had a very small sample size at tight end last year. Always got to throw in a dad joke. He finished the year as a tight end 33, 9% target share, averaging 3.7 points per game, 40 receptions for 350 yards and 1 touchdown. His one game over 8 points was the time he caught that touchdown. Verdict on Drew Sample. Don't draft. If he somehow manages to break out, then maybe you could stream him in a bad matchup. But the reality is, you really shouldn't touch him with a 6-foot pole. He's just going to be there. He's going to be on the field. He'll get a catch only if the defense forgets about his existence, which the team he plays for often does anyway. So to wrap up the episode, pay attention to the news. We're in the season where you have a lot of coach speak. They're going to be hyping up the guys they drafted, hyping up the guys they signed. Teams are going to be trying to predict the workload for each team. So we just pay attention to the system, what's happening in training camp, pay attention to who's in first team reps versus second team reps, because that might give you a little bit of insight on what the team is going to be doing that season. Mock draft like crazy. This is when players are going to be jumping up and down the boards. So you really need to know, pay attention to the news because that'll tell you why a player is jumping up or falling down in drafts. Since I don't have a drink, we're going to finish this podcast as we always do, as in a fake cheers to the camera, and I'll see you guys all next time. Let me know in the comment section what you think about the guys we talked about today. If you have an opinion that's definitely different from mine, I'd love to debate it with you. But See you guys next time.